Back with the India development debate on ET now. Let's shift focus to the second debate tonight. Don't have the power to regulate state-owned banks, and it's virtually impossible to audit each and every branch of all banks in the country. That's the message from RBI Governor Urjit Patel to lawmakers of the country. Deposing before the Parliamentary Panel on Finance, Patel made it clear that the RBI is neither equipped nor empowered to stop big bank scams. Patel, however, assured MPs that efforts will be made to strengthen the regulatory mechanisms, even as he clarified that domestic banks will tide over the current crisis soon. Interestingly, former RBI Governor Y.V. Reddy had recently come down heavily on the central bank and the government for their failure to prevent the big bank loot, including the 13,000 crore rupee fund siphoning by diamond merchant Nirav Modi. Is Governor Patel justified in washing off his hands from the RBI's failure to stop the big bank loot? Isn't it time the state-owned banks are brought under the regulatory supervision of the RBI? What about the role of the government, which is the majority owner of public sector banks? More importantly, is the worst over for the Indian banking system? That's what we're going to debate tonight on the second edition of the India Development Debate, and it's a really special panel that's joining us on the show this evening. Maithili Busrumat, Consulting Editor, ET Now; H.R. Khan, former RBI Deputy Governor; Dr. Arvind Virmani, President, Forum for Strategic Initiative and President, Chintan; and Anand Narayan, Money Market Expert. Thank you all so much for taking time out and joining us on this edition of the India Development Debate. Dr. Virmani, I'll start with you. RBI Governor Urjit Patel has today told a parliamentary panel that the central bank has inadequate powers to regulate state-owned banks, and he's blamed the board of PNB for failing to detect the scam. The RBI says, and I quote, "It is pertinent to recognize that the primary responsibility of understanding the risks undertaken by a bank and ensuring that the risks are appropriately managed through necessary risk mitigants rests with the board of the concerned bank," unquote. Is the governor passing the buck?
Well, let me start with the second question first. The first one is much broader. So, PNB, from what I have learnt from even former PNB managers, is that the first level at the branch was a miserable failure. You talked about, people have talked about the electronic systems, etc. But he said that the basic checking system, there are 5 levels of checking at the branch level, and none of them detected the fraud which was going on. So clearly the whole management structure of the PNP had deteriorated to the point where these basic things which used to be there 10 years, 20 years ago, 30 years ago were not operating. Now that does not mean that there was no failure at the higher level, but it really starts from the bottom and goes all the way to the top, because you can't have this kind of thing going on in many different banks unless there is a long-term deterioration in the functioning. Now the first question of yours on RBI and its powers. Now formally, you can always look at the law and say that it makes no distinction between private and public sector banks, and therefore if RBI has sufficient power for private banks, it does with public. But that's not how the system operates. If a RBI has to make major changes in any bank, it really always needs the permission of the government, or it always discusses, and effectively the government has a veto power. I'm talking about major changes, like if there is a fraud at the highest level of the bank or something like that, and you need to completely either take over the bank or do drastic changes. Now by its inherent nature, the government will be biased towards the public sector bank, because if there is a failure of a public sector bank which requires RBI action, it reflects on the central government. So I would say there are implicit things. Now I'm not really sure what he means by formal changes, because a lot of this is informal, and I'm not at all sure what formal changes would change the situation. The only thing I can think of which would fundamentally change this relationship is if the governments gave up its controlling vote share in the public sector banks.
I take that point. Before I take it to Mr. Khan, I want to get a quick word from Maithili. Maithili, put this in perspective. Government blames the bank and RBI. RBI is blaming the bank and the board and the auditors. Even today, the governor told Parliament panel that RBI can't do anything if PNB submitted factually incorrect compliance reports. So he's saying, what can we do? We asked them to, to audit, and they submitted factually incorrect compliance reports. Simple question: who should the taxpayer blame? Because this is just, seems like a never-ending blame game for a colossal fraud.
Well, yes, it is true that there is a colossal fraud in the case of PNB, and though it is also true that you cannot catch every single fraud, in the case of PNB, though the primary responsibility remains that of the bank, I think the RBI had a huge responsibility also, which it completely failed to fulfill. And when you asked whether the RBI governor was passing the buck, I would say most certainly he was passing the buck, he is passing the buck, and in fact he's begun to sound like a stuck record, because this is exactly the same point that he made in March at the Gujarat Law University, and the government contested it. Many people contested it, but the governor is refusing to accept blame, even though the fact is that the RBI was found severely wanting. Yes, the then Deputy Governor Mundra had cautioned the banks, RBI had issued circular, but did the RBI follow it up? What was the RBI representative nominee on the PNB board doing? In the case of every public sector bank, there is an RBI nominee director, not only on the board, but on every single committee of the board. So if there was some serious lapse at the board level, why didn't the nominee director stand up and point out to it? So I think this is a colossal failure both of PNB and of Reserve Bank of India. And whereas we are willing to treat PNB as make it everybody's favorite whipping boy, in the case of RBI, hardly any fingers are being pointed. And Mr. Virwani said that the government has a bias in favor of public sector banks. I would beg to disagree. Look at the summary action they took against the Allahabad Bank CEO, and what is the action that they have taken against the ICICI Bank chairman? Nothing at all. In fact, the government nominee does not even attend the meetings. So yes, I would think there is a colossal failure on the Reserve Bank of India's part also. They need to beef up their supervision and need to go a long way to improve the kind of supervision they have, not only of public sector banks, but also of private sector banks.
Mathi making some strong points there. Let's take it to Mr. Khan, who's represented the RBI. I'm guessing you will not be as uncharitable as Maithili has been to the central bank, Mr. Khan. But Urjit Patel's predecessor, Y.V. Reddy, Governor Reddy, I'm sure you worked with him, said recently, and you must have seen that quote as well. And he said, and for the benefit of our viewers, I'm going to quote him here. He says the PNB fraud is of such a magnitude that it affects the credibility of the RBI in ensuring the trust of people in banking. To this extent, it has to review its own regulation and supervisory practices. Do you agree with that assessment, that it also reflects poorly on the central bank?
Let me try to put this in a perspective. The current system, we have moved from micromanaging banks to more of a prudential regulation. And there was a committee under Dr. K.C. Chakravarti in 2012 with a representative from banks also, to come out with a new framework for a supervisory system which RBI was following, and it was following the best global practices. Taking that into account, we moved to what is known as risk-based supervision. The risk-based supervision focuses on the macro issues and risk, and it goes with an understanding that the internal control system of banks, the audit function of the bank are functioning effectively, and RBI was to look at the macro and prudential aspect, not get into nitty-gritties. I think that understanding that banks have matured, the internal systems are robust, I think that understanding probably we have to relook. So there is no point passing the buck or blaming each other with the government and RBI. I think it's a collective issue. Government as RBI as an owner, RBI as a regulator and supervisor, auditors, internal auditors, and a host of intermediaries who also work in and around banks. For example, we have in the credit market, how the intermediaries are functioning. So I think there is a whole host of people involved in this. So I don't think pointing out one single institution or one facet of that will be the right approach.
Okay, I take that point, Mr. Khan. Anand Narayan, I want you to comment on that. How does one reconcile comments of former Governor Reddy with Governor Patel's view that it is infeasible for a banking regulator to be in every nook and corner of banking activity to rule out any frauds? He says RBI can't audit every activity that happens in 1,16,000 commercial banks in the country.
Well, Sandeep, I think there is merit on both sides, and I'll tell you why. Look, I come from markets, and I can tell you as a banker in markets, there were several levels of checks and balances on everything that we did. There was front office, which was checked by middle office, which was checked by operational risk, which was checked by internal audit and by concurrent audit, and by the board, and finally by the RBI auditor. There were so many levels that for an RBI audit to come in and start doing everything from scratch would have just been redundant at many levels. Now, what you end up doing if you start micromanaging and looking at small things, as Mr. Khan was saying, is you end up sometimes missing the big risks. And to that extent, therefore, I think the risk-based supervision, which is global practice at the moment, makes a lot of sense. By the way, even under this RBS framework, I think there are questions for both the PNB and the government and the RBI to answer. Because the risk, while it looked like a fraud at a branch level, the core risk was the fact that you had two systems which were not talking to each other, identified by the RBI. So, what did RBI ask PNB to verify that there is a manual check around that process? And what did PNB respond is a question for everybody to ask. However, where this, framework of risk-based supervision might not work is in the public sector domain, where frankly the board, which is ultimately the warehouse of all risk, as has been pointed out in several committees, including the PJ Naik committee, doesn't really function as a normal board for a normal company under Companies Act. And it's not just about dual supervision and dual regulators. I think the PJ Naik committee goes deeper into that. Besides dual regulators, you also have the issue of the board not being as autonomous or as empowered as you would in a normal company. You also have CVC, CAG, a whole multitude of other things which impinge upon this company. And lastly, the HR policies, including the CEO tenure, who appoints the CEO, hire and fire, promotions, etc., are outside of the control of the board and management. Okay. With this non-level playing field, frankly, I think we have to have probably different systems to manage the risks around public sector banks.
Okay, I take that point. Coming to you, Mr. Khan, let's get the facts right on this for the benefit of our viewer. As per Section 51 of the Banking Regulatory Act, RBI has all the powers to regulate banking companies. A banking company is any company that transacts business of banking in India. However, SBI and other nationalized banks are not companies but corporations formed by statutes, and so are not technically banking companies. Now, Governor Patel has said that Section 51 of the Banking Regulatory Act does not give the central bank the power to appoint or remove chairman or directors on the board. So he says that the hands are tied. Do you really buy that argument?
No, there is a merit in that argument, and in fact, IMF in its financial sector assessment report have also pointed out this gap. But then there is another issue. You should have the power, and you should have the capacity and willingness to enforce the power. I think both are important, but enabling provisions certainly are needed.
Saying enabling provisions are needed. Dr. Virmani, RBI as of today does not have the power to appoint or remove CMDs or directors in public sector banks. It does not have the power to call a meeting of directors of a bank, appoint observers, order the bank to make changes to management, supersede the board of directors, make application for winding up, sanction scheme of voluntary amalgamation. All this has been said by Urjit Patel to the parliamentary panel. In light of this, Urjit Patel says there is a need to amend Section 51 of the Banking Regulatory Act for full control of PSBs. Is that a fair ask?
Well, let's start with what Mr. Narayan was hinting at. From my time, there was a short period in the 90s when directors were selected. At least an attempt was made to select directors who had some professional experience, who would act professionally. But for the rest of the time, and this lasted, I think, for maybe 5 years or 6 years, but the rest, and it's rapidly deteriorated back to the old system. So in my 30 plus years in government, only 5 out of those 30 years was any kind of professional board selected. I mean, these people, in fact, I don't want to make accusations, but some of them are there just to make money for themselves. And so, this issue which you are raising of HR practices, he was very polite, Mr. Narayan, and I've heard him before on this, is that the whole system, the incentive structure has never been there. We've been through this process of appointing a bank board and this and that, and we'll keep talking about it. I have 30 years of hearing these sort of things, that somehow by putting something else in place, we will change the nature of the public sector banks. But it always reverts to the same old thing. These people are not there to make money for the bank itself, maybe for themselves. They are not there to provide good credit. They are not there, and I'm talking about the majority, because a board has to have the majority to select a good chairman, to appoint other directors, etc. So in my personal view, it just will not work.
Okay.
In the public sector bank case, you can do whatever you want. You can have another board, a holding company, and so on, and you can give the RBI more powers. But if you don't appoint, if the system incentives are not there to appoint people who will actually run the bank like a bank.
Okay, I take that point. You're saying giving more powers is not necessarily going to solve the problem. A lot more needs to be done in the direction of governance reform of public sector banks. That's a point well taken, but Maitri, I want to sort of get the focus back to what we're debating, which is, let's look at what the RBI can do. Should the RBI be given more powers, and is that an excuse that cuts ice? What can the RBI do as of now? It has a nominee on the board of of public sector banks, like you pointed out. It can bring in any institutional mechanism to monitor working of the banks. It can bring any banks under the PCA framework. It also has authority to ensure all internal and concurrent auditors are following RBI guidelines and instructions. So in some sense, RBI already has enough powers to crack down on state-owned banks. Does it or does it not?
Oh, absolutely, Sandeep. And what I would like to ask to respond to Governor Patel's grouse that the RBI, should be given the powers under Section 51 that it has in the case of private sector banks. What I would like to ask RBI and the Governor himself was, what has the RBI done with these powers? How many boards of large banks has it superseded? How many CEOs has it sacked? We have the case of Axis Bank, Yes Bank, where there have been huge differences in the balance sheet and the provisions that have been made. We have the more recent case of ICICI Bank. What has the RBI done with those powers? In fact, the RBI has been very shy of doing anything with those kind of powers. So there's no point having powers if you're not going to use them. Yes, the fact that the government is a dominant owner in the case of public sector banks does handicap you in some ways. But as the former governor, Dr. Rangarajan, also said, that the RBI's powers of supervision vis-a-vis private and public sector banks are no different. But yes, you have to you consult the government in the case of public sector banks. And let me also tell you that if the powers were so different, then you would think, fine, private sector banks much better run, much better governed. But when it comes to governance structures, now the same kind of questions are being asked of private sector banks as in the case of public sector banks. And you have additional checks and balances, the CAG, CVC, etc., which in many ways makes the public sector banks much less nimble. There are also additional checks. So I don't buy this argument at all. In fact, that the lack of powers is what is holding RBI back. In fact, the RBI has forced public sector banks to take on banks like GTB, a sick private sector bank. It was not thrust upon a private sector bank. It was a public sector bank which was forced to take it over. So wherever the RBI wanted to arm twist, it has arm twisted. And this is a very convenient excuse. In fact, it reminds me of the famous quote from Hamlet, "The governor doth protest too much, methinks." So I really do not buy this argument at all. If you have power, it is not lack of power. Yes, there are certain differences, but it is not for want of power.
Okay, I take that point, and you've raised a valid question on the regulation of private sector banks, and I'll come to that. But Anant, I want to get this one issue out of the way before we talk about private banks, which is, in defense of RBI, at the end of the day, the PNB scam went undetected as there was no reconciliation of PNB's SWIFT messaging system with the CBS, right? RBI claims it had sent repeated warnings and PNB sort of, reverted, saying that it is in compliance. So is it then fair to pin the blame on the central bank? Because this is the crux of the issue that happened at PNB, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think the primary responsibility clearly lies with PNB itself, because this is such an egregious fraud, and which should have been detected at multiple levels with reconciliation, change in personnel, maker checker. I can name 10 levels of control where this should have got caught. Having said that, where I'm unclear is the major risk of the difference or the dichotomy between the Swiss system and the CBS system was known to the RBI. I'd be very interested to know what exactly RBI did with that information. Did it insist on a manual reconciliation being done and shown? And did PNB in turn respond to the RBI saying, we've done everything, don't worry about it? In which case, frankly, the fault is all the more of PNB. But going back to this point about the governor asking for Article 51 to go away, I think that's only a microcosm of the overall issue. And frankly, the debate is becoming too narrow with only the question of dual regulator. I think it's a larger problem. Sandeep, if we don't want a repeat of the NPMS, if we don't want frauds to go around, if we want, as Dr. Reddy was saying, we want the banking system to be a lot more safer, I think a whole host of reforms have to happen. And by the way, there is a decent solution, glide path available in the form of the PJ Naik report, which actually talks about several issues, including the issue of dual regulation by RBI and the government. It talks about the board not being a proper board. It talks about HR practices not being a level playing field with private sector, and it talks about all the the issues and shackles we have around public sector banks, including CVC, CAG, right to information, and so on and so forth. And there is a glide path of how we can get away from it. But what it requires is the government to let go of banks, of public sector banks. And that's where I think they're faltering. The reality is you require a banking investment company which is away from the government. You need to eventually think about doing away with the Nationalized Bank Act and the State Bank of India Act. These are all politically tough decisions, and it also lets go of government from the North, or power from the North Bloc, which is not easy to do. The roadmap is there for a proper reform of the public sector system. Unfortunately, we are not progressing ahead on that.
The roadmap is there. What's not there is political intent, says Anant Narayan. But Mr. Khan, even if we were to take the governor's argument at face value and conclude that RBI has limited control over public sector banks, the point that Maithili was making, what about private banks? What's stopping the RBI from applying the fit and proper criteria in the case of, say, ICICI Bank? I mean, on what basis were these clean chits given? So does this in some sense also expose the double standard of the central bank, Mr. Khan?
No, let me not comment so much about the double standards. In fact, in the case of another large private sector bank, RBI did stop the extension of the chief executive because of certain issues, and in case of ICICI Bank, I think RBI did raise red flags. The details I won't know, but there the issues were raised. But the other point, I agree partly with Maithili, that the powers, once you have powers, you can do everything. That's not the case. Powers provide the necessary condition, but not sufficient condition to act. So I think it's a both combination, as I mentioned, of enabling provision and the capacity and willingness to use that power. I think RBI is also probably internally looking at its own supervisory and regulatory process. In fact, for the last few years, we were one of the sophisticated supervisory system meeting the global standards. I think there is need to further improvise, and maybe we may have to go back to the old school of bit of transaction testing, bit of branch level auditing, where there are large business is happening, particularly in the forex side business is happening. I think those things have to be now captured in the process, and also the process testing. What are the processes followed? Because RBI relied a lot on the internal systems of the bank. I think that relevance was a bit misplaced. I think that they have to do a bit of micromanagement along with what they are doing under RBS.
Okay, final word to you, Dr. Virmani. What can the central bank now do? Let's sort of, put an end to this blame game for now. What can the central bank now do to regain credibility that it has lost in the light of PNB scam and in light of the inaction in the case of ICICI Bank case as well? What can the central bank do to regain credibility?
See, just I want to say that this assumption that the private sector banks are as bad as the public sector is just not true. The NPAs of the public sector banks are 16%, those of the private banks are 5%. I don't see how this can be said to be the same. I just don't understand the point. On the more general question, the job of the regulator is to check systems. I think I think one of the problems is the degree of expertise, and I think there I agree with my old friend Venu Reddy, that perhaps because of the difficulties of hiring experts with current market and other knowledge which affects the public sector generally, the RBI a little less but still affects it, they are not perhaps able to keep up with all the innovation that is occurring. You have to be able to analyze systems and this is also a systemic failure. It's not just the fraud. There are, as many people have said, there is a problem at every level, which means that there is a systemic problem. Now, part of this, as we have already discussed, is this governance issue, that there is an inherent problem in the way the government chooses directors and chairmen. So, let us leave that aside.
Sure.
But the other problem, I also agree with Mr. Khan, because I have had the occasion to have several governors as friends. I also know, and I don't want to mention names, people who really stood up when there was a problem. There used to be a governor, which I will not name. He said, I used to go with a resignation letter in my pocket, that if I went to the finance minister and said this has to be done, and he refused, I would say, here's my resignation, you appoint somebody who will do what you want. So there is both these things. And I think I would conclude, if you're running out of time, by saying there are many levels, and I agree that there's no point in just pointing a finger at one institution or the other. You have to look at the whole system again.
Oh yes, we need to look at the whole system again, and this scam for sure provides an opportunity for us to look at the whole system again. Completely out of time, Mr. Khan, Dr. Virmani, Anant and Maithili, appreciate you joining us in this edition of the India Development Debate. The time for blame game is clearly over, but at the end of the day, here's the reality. Nirav Modi is in London. The entire scam has happened. The government is blaming the RBI. RBI is blaming the board. The board is sort of saying that we had limited control on the matter. And one Usha Ananthasubramaniam, one representative of the board, has now been sacked by the RBI, clearly by the government rather. A lot more needs to be done to restore credibility of the banking system in light of the PNB scam. Timed out of this edition of the India Development Debate. Up next is Top 10 at 10 with Tanya. Keep it with ET Now.